What if I told you that the biggest part of who you are is still hidden, even from yourself? This isn't some mystical riddle or a truth that life will casually reveal as the years go by. No, it's something far more uncomfortable, a reality you've learned to expertly ignore. Because no matter how hard you try to present your best self, no matter how much you fine-tune every gesture and every word to be accepted, deep down you know there are corners within you that you'd rather not look at. Not because they don't matter, but because you're terrified of what you might find there. But that shadow doesn't disappear just because you close your eyes. You keep walking through life carrying this sense that something's missing, like there's an invisible weight you can't explain. Maybe you've tried to lighten it by searching outside yourself. In other people's approval, in achievements that promised fulfillment, in relationships where you hoped to recover the parts of you that got lost along the way. Yet, there's still an emptiness that lingers. A quiet echo that reminds you, in those silent moments, that stacking up accomplishments means nothing if you don't even know who's living them. Carl Jung understood this with brutal honesty. You can't be whole if you're not willing to face your own darkness. This isn't about being dramatic or turning yourself into some emotional martyr. It's about recognizing a truth no one teaches you, but you've always felt deep down. Real growth isn't about perfecting the image you show the world. It's about making peace with the parts of you you've been hiding. You've been told that your goal is to shine, to stay positive, to keep moving toward the light. But have you ever wondered what happens to everything you keep shoving into the back of your mind? Every thought you labeled as inappropriate, every emotion you were taught to suppress, every impulse that didn't fit into the mold of what's acceptable, none of that vanished. It's all still there, waiting in the shadow. And the shadow isn't evil. It's not your enemy, but it will become one if you keep pretending it doesn't exist. Jung didn't talk about the shadow as some abstract idea. He saw it as an essential part of who you are. It's the collection of all the repressed traits, the versions of yourself you learned to hide because you were afraid of being rejected. But here's the irony. The more you deny it, the more power you give it. Because everything you refuse to accept within you ends up controlling you from the dark. Maybe you think facing your shadow sounds painful. And it is. It means dismantling the carefully built image of who you thought you were. But it's also freeing. Because when you finally accept those dark parts, you stop being their prisoner. You stop living on the defensive, terrified that someone else might notice them. And in that acceptance, you start to become truly free. It's no coincidence that you often catch yourself reacting in ways you don't even understand. A harmless comment that irritates you way more than it should, a criticism that stings deeper than it logically should, a wave of inferiority that hits you out of nowhere. All of that is your shadow trying to speak up. And like everyone else, you've learned to silence those voices, to cover up those reactions, to keep moving forward without looking back. But ignoring the shadow doesn't make it harmless. In fact, it turns it into a ticking time bomb. Because what you repress doesn't go away, it twists and mutates. And what you refuse to see in yourself, you start projecting onto others. That's how you end up noticing in people the very things you can't bear to face in your own heart. That's how exaggerated judgments, absurd rivalries, and emotional overreactions are born. Jung knew this. The only way to stop projecting is to look inside yourself with raw honesty. Not with guilt, not with shame, but with the courage of someone who understands they can't be whole until they stop running from themselves. Society, however, pushes you in the opposite direction. You're taught to polish your mask, to collect virtues you can proudly display, to build an identity that's bulletproof against criticism. But the thicker your mask gets, the more fragile you become inside. Because what's real is never on the surface. What's real lives in the uncomfortable corners, in the parts of you that you'd rather not admit exist, but those are the only parts that can give you back your authenticity. And this is where the unsettling question shows up. How much of you actually belongs to you? How many of your ideas, your beliefs, your convictions were born from a genuine encounter with yourself, and how many are just echoes of what you thought others wanted to hear? The shadow doesn't destroy you. What destroys you is the constant denial of its existence. It's easy to believe that happiness is about stacking up positive experiences, surrounding yourself with good vibes, staying in a permanent state of optimism. But life keeps proving that's not enough. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical effort. It comes from being disconnected from your own self. An emptiness that no amount of external noise can ever fill. The journey back to yourself is not comfortable. It's a descent into places where your certainties fall apart, where the labels you wore for years start to lose meaning. But it's the only real path to integrity. Because fulfillment isn't the absence of conflict. It's your ability to carry it without breaking. Accepting your shadow doesn't make you a worse person. It makes you more human. And in a world that rewards appearances, choosing to be fully human is a rebellious act. It's not about exposing your flaws to the world. It's about recognizing them so they lose their power over you. The shadow, when faced, stops being an enemy and becomes an ally. It becomes a source of creativity, of depth, of authenticity. But only if you have the guts to look it in the eye. Every time you betray yourself, every time you go on autopilot, every time you repeat patterns you despise, that's your shadow showing up. Not to punish you, but to remind you, you won't be free until you make peace with yourself. Jung summed it up in a sentence that could guide your entire life. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. It's not fate making the choices. It's your unconscious doing it for you. And in that sense, the greatest act of freedom you can ever make isn't about changing your circumstances. It's about changing how you relate to what you fear within yourself. Because at the end of the day, you are not the masks you wear. You are what's left when you finally decide to take them off. The biggest lie you'll ever tell isn't to other people. It's pretending you don't see what's eating you alive from the inside. You've gotten really good at avoiding silence because that's when your mind runs out of distractions. And in those moments, the things you'd rather not face start to surface. That's why you keep yourself busy, piling on more stimuli, more responsibilities, more urgency, anything to keep you running. But running doesn't change the fact that, sooner or later, you'll have to stop. And when you do, you'll come face to face with yourself. It's funny how comfortable you are talking about personal growth, about leveling up, about success. Yet you avoid the most crucial topic of all, your own shadow. That part of you that doesn't fit into the polished image you're trying to project. The part you judge, the part you hide, but that still operates in the background, shaping your decisions, sabotaging your attempts at freedom. You can't outrun it because it's yours. And every time you ignore it, you lose a piece of your authenticity. You might think that being aware of your flaws would make you weaker, more vulnerable. But it's the exact opposite. Real strength doesn't come from perfection, it comes from integrity. And integrity only happens when you embrace every part of yourself, even the parts you wish you didn't have. The shadow doesn't vanish just because you shove it down. It just shifts shape. Sometimes it turns into oversized pride. Other times, it morphs into hidden insecurities or unexplained resentments. But it's always there, working in the background, waiting to be acknowledged. Here's the paradox. The more you run from your shadow, the more you rely on other people's approval. You need them to validate you because you haven't learned to validate yourself. And that's how you become trapped. A prisoner of everyone else's expectations, stuck in a never-ending race to fit in. But fitting in isn't the same as belonging. You can fit in anywhere if you contort yourself enough, but you only belong when you can show up fully, with your light and your darkness, without having to hide anything. Carl Jung didn't talk about the shadow to scare you. He talked about it to set you free. He understood that the unconscious doesn't disappear just because you choose to ignore it. It shows up in ways you can't control. Your knee-jerk reactions, your contradictions, those emotional outbursts that seem to come out of nowhere, that's your shadow trying to get your attention. And every time you push it down, you're feeding it more power. Have you noticed how certain people irritate you for no obvious reason? How certain behaviors in others get under your skin, as if they hit a nerve you didn't even know was there? That's no coincidence. More often than not, the things you criticize in other people are just reflections of what you can't stand to face in yourself. That's projection, a defense mechanism that shields you from the discomfort of self-confrontation but, in the long run, keeps you disconnected from the truth. Because when you project your shadow onto others, you rob yourself of the chance to really know who you are. Looking inward is uncomfortable. It requires tearing down your own masks, confronting your contradictions, admitting that you're not as virtuous as you like to think. But it's the only real path to freedom. You can't truly make decisions for yourself if you're still being run by parts of you that you refuse to see. You've been taught that the goal is to always stay positive, to control your emotions, to keep your cool no matter what. But Jung knew that taken to the extreme, that's dangerous. You can't amputate parts of your soul without paying a price. The shadow isn't your enemy, it's a part of you that's waiting to be integrated. In fact, it often holds the key to your deepest creativity, your intuition, your inner strength. But the more you repress it, the more it twists and turns into self-sabotage. Embracing your shadow doesn't mean excusing your mistakes or celebrating your flaws. It means facing them head-on, acknowledging they exist, understanding where they come from, and consciously deciding what you're going to do with them. That's the difference between being a slave to your impulses and being in control of yourself. And that difference is built through radical honesty. It's not easy to accept that you carry anger, envy, fear, pride. But those emotions don't define you, they make you human. The real problem starts when you deny them, when you get so caught up in playing a flawless version of yourself that the pressure builds underneath. Because everything you suppress piles up. And when it finally explodes, it does so in the worst ways. Words you can't take back, reckless decisions, cycles of guilt that keep you trapped. Facing your shadow is an act of humility, but also of courage. It means accepting that you don't always have the answers, that your wounds shape how you see the world, that many of your strongest convictions are actually just well-crafted defense mechanisms. But that acceptance doesn't take away your worth. On the contrary, it gives you the power to act with awareness, to relate to others with empathy instead of projection. Every person who annoys you is an invitation to discover something about yourself you've been avoiding. Every overwhelming emotion is a message from your unconscious, asking to be heard. It's easy to ignore those signals, but the price is steep. A life lived on autopilot, reacting without ever really knowing why. The shadow doesn't disappear through theories or motivational quotes. It fades when you choose to sit with yourself, in stillness, and ask the honest question, what part of me am I refusing to see? And then, little by little, you start peeling back the layers. You find that behind your arrogance, there's insecurity. Behind your coldness, there's a fear of rejection. Behind your perfectionism, there's a desperate need to feel worthy. This isn't an overnight process. It's a lifelong journey, a constant, sometimes brutal, confrontation with parts of you that will keep shifting shape but will always be part of your story. The difference is that once you start recognizing them, they lose their power to scare you. And in that reconciliation, you find a solid ground within yourself that no external circumstance can shake. Jung said, "What you deny controls you. What you accept transforms you." And that transformation isn't some lofty, abstract ideal. It's a tangible shift in how you move through the world. You stop reacting automatically. You learn to pause before you act, to give yourself the space to understand before you judge. And that changes everything. It allows you to build relationships that are real, because you're no longer defending an image. You're showing up as yourself, unapologetically, but without the need to prove anything. But let's be clear, this path isn't for everyone. Not because some people are destined to stay ignorant, but because it demands a level of courage that many aren't ready to embrace. It's far easier to keep chasing the illusion of perfection than to stop and face your own shadows. But life has a way of forcing that confrontation sooner or later. And when that moment comes, the real question is, will you be ready to meet your own gaze? The shadow isn't a burden. It's an opportunity. A door to a version of you that's more honest, more grounded, more fully human. But that door only opens when you stop being afraid of what's behind it. And now you're left with the most uncomfortable question of all. Are you willing to stop running from yourself? Not as some heroic gesture, not as a challenge to post on social media, but in the quiet of your own conscience, where there are no witnesses, no applause, no distractions to soften the sting of truth. Because that's where everything begins. Not out there. Not in what others think. Not in the labels you've clung to for a sense of worth. It starts in that space where it's just you, stripped of excuses, face to face with the raw reflection of who you really are. Your shadow isn't an enemy you need to defeat. There's no victory to be had in waging war against a part of yourself. What there is a reunion. A quiet reconciliation with those emotions, those impulses, those thoughts you've spent so long trying to exile because someone told you they were wrong, unworthy, or made you weak. But real weakness isn't in accepting those parts, it's in denying them. Pretending they don't exist doesn't make you stronger. It makes you brittle, because it forces you to constantly hold up a mask, and sooner or later, anything built on tension will crack. Maybe for years you've convinced yourself that your worth is tied to being flawless. Never slipping up, never making mistakes, never showing cracks. But the harder you try to be perfect, the further you drift from being human. Perfection doesn't connect. It doesn't inspire love. It doesn't build real bonds. It's in the imperfections where authenticity lives. It's in vulnerability where true strength is born. And that vulnerability only shows up when you stop being afraid of your shadow and decide to embrace it. Think about how many times you've held back from saying what you really felt because you feared being judged. How many situations you tolerated that tore you apart inside just to keep up an image. How many times you chose to please others instead of being honest with yourself. All of that comes with a cost. A cost that isn't always visible in the moment but builds up over time, like an invisible weight that steals the lightness from your life. And that burden doesn't come from your flaws, it comes from the constant pressure to hide them. But imagine, even for a second, what it would be like to live without that weight. To wake up every day without needing to hold up a mask. To connect with people without constantly calculating every gesture, every word, every reaction. Not from arrogance, but from the calm of knowing you have nothing to prove because you're no longer at war with yourself. That's what happens when you make peace with your shadow. It doesn't make you perfect, but it makes you whole. And wholeness has a beauty that needs no decoration. Transformation doesn't happen in an instant. It's not a light bulb moment or a sudden epiphany that fixes everything. It's a slow, sometimes painful process of learning to look at yourself without filters, without excuses, with a kind of honesty that can be uncomfortable but is also freeing. Because in every encounter with your shadow, you discover that you're not as fragile as you thought. That you can carry the weight of your own darkness without breaking. And in that acceptance, you start to see others differently too. With more understanding, less judgment. Because the person who has embraced their own shadow stops projecting it onto everyone else. And that changes everything. It changes how you love, because you stop expecting others to give you what you refuse to give yourself. It changes how you get angry, because you understand that often, anger is just a reflection. It changes how you relate to success, because you stop needing the world's applause to feel worthy. It's a shift that doesn't need to be announced, doesn't need to be shown off, but people can feel it. Because someone who's at peace with themselves radiates a presence that speaks louder than words. Your shadow isn't just darkness. It's also the gatekeeper of your untapped potential. Many of the qualities you admire in others, authenticity, creativity, courage, are trapped behind those walls you built to protect yourself. And until you tear them down, they'll remain a distant promise. But when you dare to dismantle those barriers, you'll realize that within the parts of yourself you feared the most lies the seed of your freedom. And yes, it'll hurt. Looking inward always hurts at first. It's a grieving process, saying goodbye to illusions, to false securities, to the labels you thought you needed. But after that wound comes the calm. A calm that doesn't depend on everything being perfect on the outside, because it comes from within. It's the calm of someone who's no longer running, who no longer feels the need to hide. And that peace, though quiet, is stronger than any shallow success. There will be times when you'll want to fall back into old habits, to shove the shadow back under the rug, to pretend the conflict is gone. That's normal. The ego doesn't surrender easily. But every time you choose to face yourself with honesty, you're taking another step toward your own truth. And with every step, the shadow becomes less of a frightening enemy and more of a quiet ally that keeps you grounded. It's not about becoming some enlightened being who never makes mistakes, never feels chaos. That's a fantasy. It's about becoming someone who, even in the middle of chaos, knows how to stand tall because they're rooted in who they are. Someone who doesn't crave constant validation because they've learned to validate themselves. Someone who isn't afraid of rejection because they've stopped rejecting themselves. That's real power. Not the kind that comes from controlling others, but the kind that comes from having conquered your own inner world. And that conquest isn't a battle, it's a reconciliation. An intimate conversation with all the parts of yourself you once denied but that are still pieces of your story, your essence, your humanity. Maybe you can't change the world, but you can change the relationship you have with yourself. And by doing that, you'll change how you exist in the world. Because a person who has made peace with their shadow no longer needs to impose, to prove, to compete for a place in someone else's gaze. They walk through life lighter, no longer carrying the burden of being someone they're not. Jung didn't hand you an easy path, but he gave you a true one. A path with no shortcuts, but with something far more valuable, the chance to become fully yourself. Not the polished version you've been trained to display, but the whole person who has always been there, waiting to be seen. And that's a decision only you can make. No one can walk that path for you. No one can gift you the sense of wholeness that only comes from facing yourself. But if you choose to do it, you'll discover something no one ever told you. There's no greater freedom than no longer being afraid of who you are. In the end, it's not about finding the perfect light. It's about learning to hold your shadow without it weighing you down. To look at yourself in the mirror and say, without fear, without pride, but with deep, quiet certainty, this is me. And that's okay. Because once you can say that from the heart, you found something no external circumstance can ever take away from you, the peace of living in your own truth.